Hey there, this is Michael Guzman. I lead Church of God of Exeter in Exeter, California, and I also am the regional pastor for Central California and oversee those Central California churches. I'm also a part of Project Imagine Roundtable, and while we were gathered together in Texas last week, I shared this tool and resource that I feel like I had been thinking of leading up to that roundtable timeframe. And then once we got there, felt like it was really fitting to be able to kind of get a picture of where we are and potentially where we're wanting to be able to go. And so I'd love to be able to put this into video format so that it was something that could be refreshed in memory, and so that we could continue to think about it as a potential framing of the dialogue that we've got, but also something that's potentially shareable too across the movement. So I'm going to share a screen right here to be able to draw it out on a whiteboard fashion and go from there. So there's basically two key values that I think I've heard about as somebody grafted into the Church of God movement and brought in that way that seem to kind of somewhat be in tension. And so the first one is that we value unity. I mean, that's one of our key values. That's something that has knit us together from the beginning. And there's this kind of high unity. I'm going to use the plus sign to be able to signify that over on this side. We want to walk in high levels of unity. We want to be able to be united across generational lines. We want to be united across lines of race. We want to be united across all kinds of different lines. We want to be a unity movement and continue to take that message of unity across really the nations that God has planted us in. Kind of on the opposite side of this spectrum is the idea that unity does sometimes come across in a low fashion. I know that there's the theoretical idea of unity that I've oftentimes heard expressed, but then there's the practical side of unity that sometimes, in my experience, has been not quite near that theoretical side. And so we may give lip service sometimes to unity, but then in practical places, our unity begins to break down. Again, you could look at this on all kinds of different lines. You could look at it from gender. Are we united, male and female, in those regards, pulling together for the sake of the kingdom? You could see it in racial lines. What does it look like, and how are we pulling together? How are we unified in those regards? And again, you can apply it in a lot of different ways. And so unity is one of those key values. The other value that I know that I've heard is spoken about is autonomy. And autonomy is, this is the way that I understand it. We want to see local leaders empowered at the local level to be the grassroots movement that we've kind of always had in our historical roots. And so we want high levels of autonomy, not for the sake of independence. I think that's when autonomy begins to be unhealthy. But we want high levels of autonomy so that the Holy Spirit can lead and guide the man or the woman of God at that local level to do the things that the Spirit of God is saying at that time frame. So I think that's a great way to be able to express what high autonomy might look like. There are times and places, too, where we might have a sense of low autonomy. And so I'm going to put this one down here on the bottom part. And that low autonomy, again, there could be a variety of reasons for it. It could be, that things are difficult. It could be that maybe we don't know what to do next. And so you can kind of see the way that these two things interplay. High autonomy at the top, low autonomy at the bottom. And there may be different ways that that gets expressed in our own, context. When you put these two values together, there is a natural tension between them, because autonomy kind of carries with it that that prefix auto, this idea of kind of doing it on our own to some degree. And so even in unhealthy degrees, that could be expressed that way. But then unity means doing that together. And so the way that these interplay creates these four different quadrants that I've kind of been playing around with to see that I can see the movement and at least expressions that I'm familiar with in different parts of this quadrant. So I'm going to start up here in the upper right hand. This feels like the place that I see a lot of the movement and the parts of the church that I'm connected to, where there's high levels of autonomy, because that's a value that we love and then sometimes even protect, but there's relatively low levels of unity. Now, that could be on a practical sense. Geography could separate people, but there ends up being this high autonomy, but low levels of experienced unity. this tends to create kind of polarized environments where it divides things. It could be dividing us along small church, medium church, and large church lines. It could divide us along socioeconomic lines, could divide us along racial lines. We end up polarized because our autonomy kind of like leads us out as the key value, but our unity is lacking. So we're kind of going maybe independently and alone. And so it does create this polarity. Kind of from a biblical framework, this reminds me of the book of Judges, and where everybody's doing what is right in their own eyes. I know that that's not a value that we, maybe not the value, but the texture of how we want to live out what we do. But from my perspective, this tends to be some of what I've experienced being a part of the movement, that instead of our autonomy leading us to greater, kingdom effectiveness together, it ends up that we kind of end up doing it alone. So that leads to this bottom left-hand corner. I see churches who have been in this place. I see churches and pastors who have been down in the low unity and the low autonomy. This isn't exactly the best place to be. This is what I would call kind of survival mode. Some churches, maybe because of economic struggle or the church growth struggle, they're low in attendance, end up down here. So their autonomy to some degree has been decreased because of a capacity issue or something else like that. Plus, they're still not connected in a wider sense, or they feel alone. They feel like they're in survival mode. This kind of from a biblical framing perspective reminds me of the Old Testament when the nation of Israel is in exile. In that sense, maybe they've been taken captive, literally in bondage. And so not to kind of take that language too far, but sometimes I see churches that are in different forms of bondage to the circumstances that they happen to be in, living in exile with low autonomy and low unity, like they've got maybe nobody else. I also notice too that oftentimes these churches that are there, or these pastors that are there, are looking for somebody to come fix the situation. Many a times, at least in the places that I'm in, they tend to, are looking for young families to come be a part of the church, and those young families will come and fix everything. And I wonder if sometimes we're not putting up too much pressure on that to produce certain ends in that degree. High unity and low autonomy, I don't see very much of this in the movement. In fact, I think this is something that we tend to be a little bit afraid of. And so this is kind of that corporation or corporate model. This might be where, there's strong levels of leadership and authority, potentially even in an unhealthy way. I don't think that it always has to be that way, but because it's low autonomy, that unity is coming at a cost where autonomy has been minimized. And so this is corporation. I think this could be, fully negatively expressed in kind of the Pharisees. There's large amounts of agreement maybe amongst their people group, but they're exclusive in other ways. And there's not a lot of autonomy because you've got to toe the line in there. Whereas I know as a movement, that's not what we really want to see. Upper right-hand corner, I believe this is where we really want to be. This is what we've touted, though, again, from my experience, we have many of the trappings of a denomination. We still, stubbornly call ourselves a movement. And I believe that that's at the heart of what we want to be. We want to be a movement of released people, regular people operating in power and authority in the kingdom of God. This, I think, from a biblical framing would be the book of Acts, where we see regular people going and doing amazing things filled with the Spirit of God, sent to do the works of God as the people of God. This is what we want to be able to see, operating in high autonomy, but also high unity, because we're way better together. There's so much that we can accomplish. So this is maybe my bias in here, or my bias from the perspective that I happen to have been a part. But what I've noticed is that we tend to kind of live and operate up here. So this is where I see it. Now, I've noticed as I talked at the roundtable that there were other churches and leaders that saw that their starting point was from somewhere else. But you could translate that from what I'm going to share right here. So if in my realm, in Central California, we tend to operate in this polarized region, I think that the likelihood that we're just going to jump across because we have new insight, hey, we're just going to increase the unity in what we do, is not likely to just be a straight across line. I think that what's going to happen as as I lead out or we lead out to see increased unity, what's going to happen is it's going to be perceived and experienced as a decrease in autonomy, just because there's going to need to be some decisions laid down. So I think the journey is likely going to look a little bit like this. I don't think that it has to go into, we're not looking to create that corporate model. I think it's going to feel that way, because every time that you move in the direction of unity, it's going to feel a little bit like a perceived experience of decrease of autonomy. But I think that the win is over here as we go and continue to move forward with those two things working together. Now, this is the difficult part that I believe we have in our future. That if we're going to see movement really restored across the movement, then and it does get tied back to this kind of tension between unity and autonomy. I think that journey right there is the big challenge that's in front of us. I think you could call that journey right there the valley of the shadow of death, because this is the place where it gets really difficult. Who's going to call the shots? Who gets to say what happens? And how does that get played out? I don't know if I like the way this is. I'm going to have to say no to this thing that I'm currently doing in order to say yes to the things that we're doing at a unity level. I think this is where the rubber meets the road, and the valley of the shadow, sorry, I didn't write that, shadow of death is probably that difficult spot where once we get there, we're going to want to turn back to the way that it used to be. So this is just a tool that I feel like God has given me as I've been thinking about our movement and the responsibilities of being on Project Imagine Roundtable. If there's anything that's helpful in here, love for you to continue a dialogue in this content. I feel like it's, definitely in first draft form. And so if there's anything that you can think of, critical parts about maybe reframing along biblical lines or coming up with new phrases like these, polarized movement, survival, or corporation, feel free. Even there was some good dialogue that I had at the round table about that word autonomy. And actually here's maybe another question for some of you who are smarter than me to be able to think of. Is autonomy really a value, or is it a byproduct? And so I really felt pressed. I feel like I'm kind of like going back into my notes to dig into that a little bit more. Is autonomy a byproduct, or is it really a value that we have? And again, that came across as, where do you see this framed? Where do you see autonomy framed in the Bible? And so we had some good questions on all of that. Love to see that framed up all the more. Blessings to you guys.